After yesterday's EU parliamentary elections, one thing is certain, not everybody is celebrating. While the right gained power, Liberals and Greens were dealt a painful blow. And to talk about the big wins and big losses of the night, as well as what they will mean for the EU, we're joined by our guest, Daniela Schwarzer from the Bertelsmann Stiftung think tank, executive member of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and also leading expert on international affairs. Good evening. So let me ask you the first question. What can we say about the impact of this election on the future of the course of the EU?
We have to look at the impact on two levels. One is obviously how the European Parliament is composed and how the party groups will come together. And what we can see from the results as they translate into seats, that Ursula von der Leyen, who is a candidate to her own succession as Commission President, will likely have the backing of her former coalition, meaning the centrists, the Conservatives, the Social Democrats, and also the Liberals. They have enough seats to get her re-elected if they all support her candidacy. It will be very interesting to see how the far right and the populist right parties that are not part of the European People's Party get organized in Parliament. The question here is, will there be one, two, or maybe even three groups in Parliament composed of those elected politicians? They have grown in numbers. However, they do not have a blocking role potentially, because it will be very likely possible to build majorities with the moderate European parties. So I expect the European Parliament to be functional, to maybe take some time to actually get the European Commission approved, first of all the President and then all the members of the European Commission. And then when it comes to governing the EU and passing laws, it should be possible to build majorities with the moderate parties. However, debates can be longer and definitely more polarized, because there are more Eurosceptics and more voices who will have dissenting views to the rather broad European consensus in Parliament. And the second dimension we have to look at is the national level. And here it gets really interesting. And even, last night after the results came in, first things happened. France is the key example here, that a bad result for a governing party, in this case for the Liberals of Emmanuel Macron in France, leads to immediate consequences on the national level. We heard Marcin Zaborowski discuss what can potentially happen in France. Elections are called for June 30th and July 7th, and we will see what happens there. In Germany, also, the domestic debate has taken off. The governing coalition lost 10 percentage points if you take all three parties together. And that also in Germany has raised questions as to whether the parliament should be re-elected. But right now, the government is not at all ready. They will continue governing. But here also you can see the effects of the European elections on the domestic debate.
As we look at what's happening right now, it doesn't come as a surprise to many that we have Eurosceptic nationalistic parties gaining seats. How do you think this is going to actually affect the governability of the European structures from now on?
Well, as I said, I think Parliament will be functional. However, debates will be more polarized, and there will definitely be new accents in the discussion. Take some of the issues where the right, and in particular the populist right and the far right, has been particularly vocal. That's the issue of migration. It's the question of how can climate change policy be potentially redesigned, and we will possibly hear more of those views, and this will oblige those parties who, for instance, continue to support the Green New Deal to make their case more strongly, to argue more for why Europe should take a lead, not only for its own domestic green transition, but also a lead role in the world, because we are facing very severe climate challenges already now, and things will only get worse. So there will be more debate, and obviously also parties will look more at those voters who are frustrated, who feel disconnected, who think things are happening that are not equitable and just. And in that regard, this election should be taken very seriously to understand better why citizens are ready to turn to those parties who actually want to leave the European Union or want to deconstruct it rather than having a positive impact within the EU to make better policies. And so those grievances need to be looked at and translated into forward-looking policies that can help citizens tackle the challenges they are facing in their daily lives.
Right, so we can agree that many voters gave a yellow card yesterday to the current leadership of the EU. So the question is whether they were voting against the EU as such, or whether they were just voting against the current policies of the EU and against the current leadership.
Indeed, and there's a third possibility. They can also have voted against their national leadership. So those three possibilities are there, and there is no one clear interpretation for all of the EU. Those elections, which we saw over the past 3 days, conducted in all 27 member states, follow very different logics depending on the national context, depending on the parties that stand for elections. And I think we saw all of the above. We saw criticism of the EU, but we also saw huge support for the European Union. We mustn't forget that a vast majority of citizens actually voted for parties that want a strong European Union, that want a Europe that stands up against Russia, that supports Ukraine. So while today, because of the strong results of the right-wing populists and far right, most of the discussion concentrates on their gains, we mustn't forget that the majority of citizens voted for parties that are very supportive of the European Union as it stands today. I'm not minimizing the effects of the vote for far-right and right-wing populists, as I argued earlier, but I do want to emphasize that we still have a very strong center in the European Parliament. So policies can continue, but they need to be refined in a way that more citizens support them.
I would like to actually take a moment to take a closer look at Germany and France and what's particularly happening within these two countries. We know that in Germany, an openly pro-Russian and anti-EU party is actually, gaining influence. It's the second biggest political force in the country. On the other hand, in France, we have Marine Le Pen that surged as well. What do you think will be the consequences for Germany, for France, and effectively for Europe, as we're looking at some of the two major member states?
Well, first of all, both governments will be inward-looking. Emmanuel Macron, because he decided to jump from one election into the next electoral campaign, and this is a very short period for campaigning, just 3 weeks, so he will have to get his party and his act together, as do all parties in France now as they face the parliamentary elections on June 30th. And he has spent a lot of time recently commenting on European affairs and making concrete suggestions how to move ahead with Europe, because he is very concerned, first of all, about Russia's war on Ukraine and has made very strong statements on what this war means for Europe, but also that the European Union is not a given, but can actually collapse, which would be a disaster for all of us in these times where there's no stability on our continent and actually a war not far away from the European Union. In Germany, also, the parties will be pretty much inward-looking. They first have to digest why all three coalition partners actually lost votes compared to the last national elections, and also compared to opinion polls that were out about the European elections. And they will refine their own positions within the coalition. And that can lead to more tensions. Already last night, there was a discussion among the party leaders on TV, and we could see how each of them actually defines their position in the coalition and says what they want to get out of this cooperation going forward. Most of all, this will be focused on budget negotiations that are currently underway, and the question how Germany prioritizes public expenditure. We, as other countries and also Poland, face the challenge of spending more on defense. Poland is at 4% of GDP. Germany just reached 2%. So we are sort of catching up with others, and we are finally fulfilling the NATO goals. But it is very clear that also Germany may need to spend more on security, both domestically and on defense externally. And then there are other tasks to master in our country. That is the green and the digital transition. A lot of investment is needed. And so the parties are right now struggling with each other, and in particular, the finance minister, who wants to keep a tight budget and doesn't want to run a strong deficit. So those debates will be very animated in the next few weeks to come.
Yes, you said that domestic issues are very much reflected in the European Parliament elections, and so we also had local elections in Germany this weekend, and the AfD party made some gains, especially in the east of the country, after it was labelled extremist by the country's intelligence services. So what does it tell us about the current social moods in Germany?
It's a very worrisome development, and not only because we had the municipal elections just now, but because also three important regions in Germany's east will go to the polls in September to elect their regional parliaments, and then new governments for the regions will be formed. And in all three regions, AfD polls strongest at the moment. That doesn't mean that they get into government if there's a possibility to form a coalition without them. But it does mean that there's considerable support for a party which holds extremist positions on migration, on issues of racism, also in some cases positions that are deemed as not compatible with our constitution. So we have a party here which has been much debated. The two lead candidates in the European elections have had respectively their scandals and are now actually excluded, in one case in particular decided today, from actually standing for the party in the European Parliament. And so despite all of this, people voted for AfD. That signifies that there is frustration within German society. We can see differences between Germany's east and Germany's west, and this will be the major task for the moderate parties ahead of the regional elections to better understand the situation and to develop an approach where they can offer a vision for people in those regions that they believe that there's actually a good future for them out there. One of the issues that is worrisome is that AfD is not a supporter of further military and financial aid to Ukraine, which currently is not discussed in the German government. They fully stand behind Ukraine, and Germany is hosting the big Ukraine recovery conference tomorrow. So there's a very strong commitment. And yet we have two parties that in the European elections openly challenged this approach and held pro-Russian positions, and the far-right AfD has been one of them. And people vote for that. So I think we need a very thorough debate within Germany, both on domestic issues and the right way forward, but also on the question what is at stake in Ukraine and why Germany should continue to be the most important supporter of Ukraine in the European Union, which it has been for a while now.
This definitely gives us something to think about and focus on days and weeks to come. Daniela Schwarzer, a leading expert on European and international affairs, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.